If you're responsible for sales in your organization, you know how challenging sales really is. Now, if you're responsible for managing a small sales team, you know how challenging that is. Now, imagine being responsible for managing hundreds of people on your sales team. Imagine being brought in to help turn around companies and teams that are really struggling. Now, imagine being able to turn around these teams, turn around these business segments and companies, and be able to start to produce real supercharged growth, year-over-year growth, continued results. Now, if you did that with a small team, that is impressive. If you do that with a team of hundreds of people, that is really impressive. But today's guest has done that at multiple companies, including some of the largest companies in the world, has done it time and time again, over a decade plus. And I thought, now here is something different because it's not just about a tactic. Clearly, if you are able to see year-over-year growth with teams of various sizes from a few hundred to many, many hundreds of people in different industries at different companies time and again, you know something that we need to know. Because I've been an entrepreneur since I was 23 and I've had corporate clients, but I've not worked in corporate for a very long time. I'm 41 today. I've worked with many, many executives, but I've never been a corporate executive. And I know that it takes a different approach to be able to grow sales. One that business owners and that marketing and sales teams at smaller and medium-sized companies, one that we can learn from. And that is what we're going to talk about today. Leading sales teams to year-over-year growth with our special guest, Chris Costello. Now, Chris is a former executive vice president for one of the world's largest online retailers. She's led multi-billion-dollar departments. She's managed teams of up to 600 sales staff across various industries. She's pioneered innovative solutions in really competitive telecom markets and has become known for leading bold moves that get results. But today, she's going to share her greatest leadership lessons. And as well, a massive bonus for you. I put her on the spot to share her insider tips on what it takes to sell to executives based on her own experience around the boardroom table. And so you'll want to stick around to the end of the talk because her tips may surprise you. So welcome to How to Sell More, the sales podcast for non-sales people, where each week our expert guests and topics cover practical branding tips, marketing tactics, and sales strategies help ambitious B2B leaders like you tackle the biggest challenge every business owner faces, and that's growing revenue. I'm Mark Drager. Let's get into it. So Chris, in your previous role, you led a and I'm going to pronounce this carefully for our listeners, a multi-billion dollar P&L segment at a massive global organization. And when I was reflecting upon your career, and the real reason that I wanted to have you on is in that role, you saw year-over-year growth. And then if we take a step back, the role you had before that role, you led a team of 600 salespeople. You delivered massive year-over-year growth plan. It was the fastest growing segment in the multinational organization across a multi-billion book of business. Now, if we take a step back to the role before that, you led 450 professional salespeople with a major turnaround. And if we take a step before that, and so I think the audience sees where we're going with this. Part of, I think, why you've been so successful in your career and what I'd love to be able to dig into you with this is you are an executive who has had a tremendous career over the last 20 years plus, seeing turnarounds, seeing action plans put into place, seeing year-over-year growth. And how is it you've been able to, how is it you've gotten so lucky, let's say?
I think some of it is pure luck. Some of it is having a work ethic, having a can-do attitude. I think the number one thing is being authentic with your teams, being accessible and running into the fire with your teams. And I've got some really good, juicy examples that hopefully we'll go through today.
Hold on. I say luck jokingly though, but you know, this is not just luck, right? What do they say? Luck is the crossroads of preparation and opportunities. So clearly, as you were able to work through the career, and I am curious because as an executive, as someone who's responsible for so many headcounts, such a large book of business, and essentially, you're working in publicly traded organizations. So you're also responsible for your segment's growth back to the shareholders. And so I'm curious, as an executive, it often looks like you're responsible for everything. But you're unable to directly control or influence anything. Has that been your experience, or is that more of an outsider's view of what it's like to be an executive in these large organizations?
Mark, I would agree with you. It doesn't matter what job you have. It doesn't matter if you're the CEO, right, or the floor sweeper. There's always a need to influence others. And if you take sales as an example, if you're running a sales organization, there's always a customer that wants something that's outside the lines. And I think of an example when I had an opportunity to win a large, complex deal, but it needed custom development. You go to the product teams, their product roadmap is full, they don't have the funding, they don't have the headcount. And in that example, ultimately, you've got to speak through the lens of the customer and the customer need. You can't go to team members that you need to influence with one-offs or complaints. It's got to be something that looks like it's sustainable, replicable to other customers. And ultimately, in this example, we were able to convince the product teams to build a custom development, showed the ROI, and showed that other customers would be able to use it. It took 6 months. So it takes patience, it takes facts, it takes data, it takes quant. But ultimately, we were able to get them in the boat, got them to invest in it. The other important thing, which is probably even more important than the business case that you have to build, is getting the teams excited, getting them to feel like they're part of the project. And then ultimately, when you get the win, you've got to recognize those team members big time.
And so when you say we, is this you leading, sleeves rolled up, strategy and action plan, and you're delegating to people? Is this where people are kind of checking in with you every once in a while and you're staying very high level? Or are you literally like leading the account and leading the presentation for these kind of large deals?
It depends on the deal. It depends on the complexity. It depends on the customer. In the example that I just shared, I personally got engaged and had a discussion with senior management, with the CTO of the company, who had some really tough decisions to make and basically said, well, what do you want to fall off the roadmap? And so in that case, I personally engaged. I helped the account executive, I helped the sales managers, et cetera. And I helped to coach them to build a rock solid business case that would get the attention of leadership to make that decision.
You mentioned the business case twice. How important is that at the end of the day? A strong case that has clear risk benefit analysis done, that clearly has proven benefits, that you have a proven process. Like I'm just thinking off the top of my head, everything that might go into a specific business case to have people move forward with it. But for these large, complex engagements, are they quite rational, quite logical because that's what's required for the decision? Or is it like, this is all safety, let's clean this up in case something goes sideways later? At least we could say we did due diligence.
I mean, I think at the end of the day, you've got to get it roughly right and go. You've got to use data. But if you get into analysis paralysis and are looking for perfection. I mean, if you've got 80% of the data, you've got to partially go with your gut and you've got to go after the market opportunity or you're going to miss the opportunity. It's not just back out accounting and clean up and perfection, but it's got to show return.
Oh, that makes so much sense. Now, I'd like to go back. When I first kicked off our conversation, I said, if we go back, there was a time in your career where you were leading a turnaround specifically for a division within a large telecom company. And in this turnaround, I'm curious, what were the challenges that you were able to identify? How did you develop a strategy? How did you achieve that strategy? I'm curious just what your team makeup looks like, what your process looks like, because I've heard it said a long time ago that a leader who can lead to growth is a great leader, but a leader who can turn something around, the J leader they talk about, the U leader, that is a totally different skill set because you almost have to reverse negative momentum, make some positive gains, and then turn everything around. So I'm curious, how did you handle that?
Sure. There was one role that I had taken on, and I quickly determined that there was poison in the water. It was a pretty toxic culture. There was not cohesion. No one was sharing best practices with each other. There wasn't trust. People were working in isolation. They were in kind of like protection mode. And the previous management, I think, didn't bring them in much on decisions, didn't make them feel part of the decision making. No one was asking for their opinions or explaining the why, bringing the outside in and explaining the why. And so step one, it was kind of a 3-step process. Step one was being authentic, me being authentic with them, showing them who I was, that I was enlisting their feedback, that I wasn't perfect, that I was going to learn from them, explaining the why of the strategy and the plan, and then getting them to weigh in on strategy and tactics to make the plan so they felt part of it. Step two, I did have some cleanup to do. There was a person that I needed to move out of the organization, and then ultimately create a culture of trust with the team and start to help all tides rise and encourage the team members to share best practices. They didn't have to hold their cards close, that everyone would do better if they shared best practices. And then step three of the turnaround was a little bit more operational and communications oriented. And that was a leaderboard, getting a leaderboard out there to get the teams excited and motivated. I established monthly what I called grow the business calls with skip levels. So I would meet with like 8 different regions, 8 different teams, and we'd go through their results. And ultimately, it was a carrot and a stick, but it helped for me to get to know them better. And it also helped us as leaders to glean best practices that we'd share with broader regions, like great tips for selling that we learned that one particular seller was doing successfully. And ultimately, I became viewed as a leader, one that holds a high bar, but also one that gained trust with the teams by advocating for them, by moving rocks out of the way, by escalating, and also by recognizing them and giving them exposure to upper management. That was another problem. They weren't getting any exposure or credit for their work. And, teams that trust you are going to deliver 150% if they're treated with respect. And the good story about this one is we started out as last in the nation, and within 6 months we turned into number 1 in the country. So it was good. It was a rough lift.
Okay, so what is your leadership and peers? What are they saying about such dramatic results? Like at that point, because I mean, going from last to first over the course of 2 quarters is dramatic. Like it's dramatic change. Like were they tapping you on the shoulder and wondering like, what the hell are you doing?
My peers, you mean?
Yeah, your peers and your leaders.
Yeah, my peers were like, show me your playbook, which I was happy to share. And some of them had been there longer than me, and I looked for their playbook. And so we were comfortable enough with each other that we shared best practices with each other. We operated as a unified leadership team versus competitors of one another. And my leadership team was happy. The very first thing that I learned from my leader at the time when I walked into that role, because I remember the first month I gave a horrible forecast, like not that the number wasn't a great number, but it was wrong. And I remember him telling me like, results are awesome, but forecasting is even more important. And so I ultimately got the forecasting right once I got the culture right, and then the results followed.
And what I'm curious about with this story is I've never led such a large team. I think at the most I've had 24 people on my team. And I found that challenging. I found it challenging to lead 24 people in a fairly flat organization. And when we think about large organizations, leadership skills are leadership skills. It sounds like there's not actually much of a difference between being a great leader of a very large team, maybe the stakes are higher, and being a really great leader of a small team, because the skills are still the same. You're still required to show up with vision. You're still required to hold people accountable, to set a path, to include people, to collaborate, all of those types of elements. I would have thought that at your role in your situation, it just would have been different, less personal. You may have been more up in very high level, very high vision, not quite as responsible for holding people accountable, leading these monthly calls, managing through kind of the 3-step process you mentioned. Is leadership the same at all levels at the end of the day?
It is and it isn't. It is a little bit harder to get the message out the larger the team. I made a concerted effort to travel to all the different regions, spend time with the teams, act like a human being, bond with people, ask people how they're doing, share things about my personal life. The grow the business calls with the skip levels took a lot of time on my calendar, but I thought that they were so important in terms of having the teams have exposure to me, but also all the best practices that I was gleaning as a result of it. But I think the number one thing, regardless of the team size, is your direct reports need to be in the boat with you. I had one point that I thought he was in the boat with me, but he was almost like pocket vetoing. And I later found out through a discreet phone call from one of his team members that, we were sharing one message and then he was sharing another message, which was kind of contrarian to what the mission was of the leadership team. So it's really important to have a good culture and leaders that trust you and leaders that you can trust.
I'm just the slight pause between us talking is me just absorbing this information, because I think listeners, you agree this is something. Now being as results focused as your career has been, with the wins that you've had, year over year growth, I was wondering, at your level of operations, your level of seniority, your level of global business that you're running, what type of results and KPIs matter most? And it was interesting that you said that your leadership said that results are good, but forecasting is what matters. And so even in that, I'm curious whether the KPIs and the metrics you use and you prefer to focus on as a leader are more trailing for KPIs or more leading KPIs. And what do you look for to ensure that you can manage results?
The first thing that I would say when it comes to KPIs, especially the ones that you roll out to your team to measure, is pick a few important ones. I've seen teams get weighed down and have seen organizations want to measure too many stats and fail, because the sales teams are then playing the Salesforce.com activity game and they're not out selling to customers. And so some people like to roll around in tons of data, and it's really not fair to burden the sales teams with all of that data. I look at things like top line revenue. I look at deal size, cycle time, profit, industry trends. My team members, teams that manage other team members and individual contributors, will also look at productivity metrics of their teams, such as number of meetings, close rate, not in a micromanagey kind of way, but to get a sense of trends and to be able to perform accurate forecasting. I also, as an executive, will deep dive at least monthly into a much more detailed set of metrics for myself to manage the business and pick out trends and insights, such as what are the top services that are selling? What are deal margin trends? What kind of credits are we issuing out to customers and why? What are my top accounts? What are my bottom accounts? What are loss reasons? What are win reasons? But you can't put every single one of those on a leaderboard, or you're just going to stress your teams out and they're going to do nothing well. In terms of, is it just a leaderboard or do you get strategic insight? I could probably share some feedback on that as well. An example, obviously there's a leaderboard that goes out on a weekly basis and a monthly basis, and it's a great motivator for team members. I've had that in every sales assignment I've had and every leadership assignment that I've had. But I remember a story that I'll share where one time we were really heavily incenting a certain product. We really wanted to go big with the launch of a new product. And the sales weren't materializing, and we were really nervous and really paranoid. And so we dug deep. So we were trying to determine what's the insight we could glean out of this. Why is this not selling? This is hotcakes. We did the press release. Everybody loves it in concept, and nothing's happening. And so we dug deep to determine, is there a problem with the product? Is there a lack of customer need? Is there a supply chain issue? Is there a macroeconomic problem? Is there a comp issue, a pricing issue? And what we learned in deep diving is the sales comp plan motivated sellers to sell long-term contracts. And what we had launched was a pay-per-use product without a long-term contract. And so ultimately, the leaderboard and the stats and the insights gave us the intelligence to change the comp plan so that people would be motivated to sell it.
Huh. That is so interesting. Now, when you say you dug deep, if you can recall that situation, does that mean digging deep in terms of turning to your sales leaders, turning to maybe the marcom department, the product department? Like, who are you bringing around the table to figure this out? Or is it literally like, let's just look at the sales activity insights and make a decision because this is simply just a sales issue?
On the surface, it was looking at the leaderboard and the stats and Salesforce.com and things like that. We also had a strategic adoption team that was doing outbound calls internally to salespeople to help them to make the sale, and also some calls directly to clients. But ultimately, where we got the most insight is talking to just honest salespeople who weren't going for the pressure. Like, I don't care what headquarters says, this is the situation. And so it was ultimately some trusted salespeople that said, Chris, I can't retire my quota this way. This is not going to fly. I'm not selling pay-per-use service. So that's where we got the real data, is talking to honest salespeople that care about how they're retiring their quota.
Oh, I love that so much. The greatest breakthroughs I've had in business for myself and my clients, and we've talked about this a lot on the podcast, listeners, it's the gap between marketing and sales and the customer, or if we take it a few steps even further back, anytime that you have one or two areas of removing yourself from being able to speak directly with the very people that your work is affecting, you're always going to get these political answers. And you're going to spend a lot of time and a lot of energy. And yet, if you can have the types of relationships, and I think back when I first started my career, I was 23, I was extremely young, but I started working at a medium-sized organization where, because of my work, I was situated with the C-suite. So I sat with all of my internal clients as a shared service, were the executives. I sat with legal, I sat with accounting, and I had the ability to walk into the CEO's office at any point. And often we had this great dialogue because he could ask me questions about what was happening, what were people thinking on the floor and how did this presentation go? And I worked in marketing communications, so I was analyzing it. But that direct relationship, that ability to I've done it myself, go to a trusted client, go to a trusted prospect that you may never win the business with, the team member, and then vice versa, them coming back up channel, being able to have those conversations without worrying about tanking your career or the politics. When you could just get down to the basics, you're going to get the answer so much quicker.
So true. Makes sense.
And so when you look back over your extremely, again, impressive career, what would be the 2 to 3 leadership lessons that you really picked up along the way that you can help share with me and of course, all of our listeners?
Sure. I used the word authentic earlier, and this was a learning for me earlier in my career. So the first leadership lesson is to be authentic. And this is based on what could have been a fatal flaw for me earlier in my career, where I had taken this Myers-Briggs, and part of it was getting 360 feedback from others. And a couple of the verbatims in the report that came back to me is, we don't know the real Chris. And when I got that feedback, I realized, and I reflected on myself, I was young in my career, I was being guarded, I was so worried about being taken seriously, that I just had this work persona that was just so buttoned up that nobody could access the real me. So I've worked literally ever since then, and this was in my early 20s, to just come across as me, the real me, what's going on in my business life, a little bit about what's going on in my personal life, and to just be me. The second leadership lesson is to be accessible, and to be accessible to all levels, and to move rocks to serve customers quickly. And so escalate for your teams. I don't care if it's the floor speaker, the CEO, whatever level it is, the junior AE, the telemarketer, the senior sales leader, any different function in an organization. They're the subject matter expert. They know what the problem is. They should feel comfortable being able to come to you. You can't stop what you're doing every second of the day and fix everything. But my team always knows that they can come to me to escalate a problem or to run into the fire with them to solve a problem with the customer. And the third leadership lesson is to empower and recognize teams. If teams feel as if you have their back, they feel like they're trusted, and they feel like they're not being micromanaged. Salespeople in particular are motivated by money, but they also appreciate recognition. It goes a long way, and knowing that you trust them and that you have their back.
I do have one bonus question. We are coming up against the time, but I would be really remiss if I didn't ask this of you. Are you game for it? Bonus question?
I'm in.
Okay. So a common theme that has come up time and again with guests on this podcast is the challenge that certainly junior, but even mid-level sales, business development people, the challenge they struggle with is being able to get time in front of the executive or the C-suite, meet with the executive or C-suite, and not just like throw up and pitch, like benefits, features, but be able to manage that, get the time, get the meeting, make the most of the meeting, sell the concept, and move on to the next step. Now, you've spent a lot of face-to-face time with some of the world's largest CEOs and leaders. You have had to do this in your career. And of course, as an executive, you have had people pitching you all the time, I imagine. So what can you share with us? What insight can you give us from your firsthand experience, both selling to C-suite and executives and at the same time being pitched constantly from others?
Sure. I'll take it from a couple of angles. One is be where your customer is. Sometimes it takes an executive to land an executive, right? To land that whale. And so one of the things that I do is I personally attend executive C-suite events. Depending on the industry, the C-suite are going somewhere at least a couple of times a year. And so make sure you're at that event. Make sure you or your sales team are setting up like 30-minute power talks and putting them on calendars in advance. Make sure you're prepped. Make sure you've got a bio of the person that you're about to meet with. Once you land the meeting, if it's at one of those trade show events, meet them for coffee or book a conference room where they can come to you. I one time went to an industry event and I had literally within a couple of days, 20 customer meetings. And the learning on that one is just make sure you're in the same place, because I was literally running, sweating, trying to get from meeting to meeting. Don't use handouts. This is a strategic one-to-one relationship building type of discussion, but you can bet I'm prepared. I know the 1 or 2 or 3 points that I want to land, but ask the customer a lot of questions of what's keeping them up at night. How can we help them with their business, but do not go into slide mode. You can't always be at customer events. Sometimes you can open the door by sending a personal note via LinkedIn. Sometimes you can have your account executive send your bio to try to open a door. So those are kind of some ideas to get to the C-suite. I once had a role where I observed that my team were selling to middle managers and they were getting small wins. And I absolutely knew if we were targeting the C-suite that we'd get a lot more wins and much bigger wins. And so we implemented this. We did this through a combination of up-leveling talent, so getting new talent that had the experience to get to the C-suite. 2, by motivating team members. And 3, we actually created an executive positioning program where we lined up some of our own executives with some of our own top accounts. And that was super successful. I also think of a deal example that is an interesting one. I was once working on a deal. It was a very large deal, and we started with the C-suite. We didn't have to ratchet our way up. We landed the meeting right away. I will tell you that deal was 2 years in the making. There were lots of meetings. There was a lot of pomp and circumstance. There were a lot of legal red lines on contracts and things like that. But we ended up landing a massive deal as well as strategic partner status versus we could have gotten a little deal in a sea of vendors. The advice on this one that I would say is really important for executives to personally invest time in whale hunting, because salespeople have quotas that they have to make, and they can't bank whether they're going to make their entire year's quota on whether they're going to win one deal or not. And so I would say executives need to personally take some of the weight when you're hunting whales and going after those large strategic deals.
Oh my goodness. This is such amazing advice. One last question for you, Chris. If you had to give us one tip or one strategy to help anyone listening just sell more, what would that be?
It's really simple. It's being a fixer. Fix problems for your customers, fix problems for your sales teams. And so, let's say you have a customer that has a long-standing billing issue that you inherited. You're the new account executive. Find a way to fix it. They're going to trust you, and then they're going to give you more business. For your team, unblock an issue, escalate, and they'll deliver strong. I once had a customer for sure that was going to fire us because we created some kind of a service problem for them. And I remember flying out to Arizona, having a dinner meeting with the CIO, getting the beatdown of my life, falling on the sword, leaving completely deflated, figuring, well, we just lost that business. Ultimately, I did fix the problem, was able to fix the problem. And 3 months later, we were awarded a multi-million-dollar contract. So being the fixer can have its rewards.
And that goes back to All the responsibility, not a ton of control, though.
Absolutely.
That was the talk I had with Chris Costello. To wrap up, I'm going to share my 3 biggest takeaways from this talk. Number 1, true leadership takes an incredible amount of time and effort. Just think back to the story that Chris was sharing in terms of one of the roles she took on that had a really toxic culture. And think of all the time and all the energy and all the work that went in to being able to turn that team around, to being able to connect with the right people, to being able to motivate them and give them the time and give them the coaching. It takes an incredible amount of time to manage people. It takes an incredible amount of energy and an incredible amount of effort. But as a leader of your team, no one is going to do this for you. And unfortunately, as much of a distraction as it feels, as much as at times it can feel like babysitting, truthfully, if we want the most out of our team, we have to give them an incredible amount of time and energy and effort. And again, no one else is going to do this for us. So it's really on us. Number 2, key performance indicators, KPIs, or basically metrics that you are going to measure will help you track progress. You do not want to bog your team down with tons and tons of bureaucracy and tons of KPIs or tracking of results. But you certainly have to be able to align the results you're hoping to achieve with the goals that they are tracking. You get those aligned and people will naturally, start to game the system to be able to play to the tracking and play to the results. And number 3, sometimes it takes a leader to sell to other leaders. And so when Chris was breaking down all of the really amazing advice on what it takes to sell to senior executives, one of those key pieces there was the fact that if you have mid-level people with mid-level experience selling to mid-level people with mid-level experience, that can work really well, but you may get smaller results. If you want to win over executives, if you want to win over other business owners, if you want to win over the decision makers in your clients' companies, it may just be time for you to step in and help shore up your sales team's approach. Come in there and have the executives sell to executives, have leaders sell to leaders, and really back up your team to make sure you can win that large client. And so there you have it. Those were my 3 biggest takeaways from this talk, but I'm curious, what were yours? Let's dive deeper into this over on LinkedIn, where I share more insights and I love to spark conversations. My name is Mark Drager, and you can find my contact details in the episode show notes. Now, while you're over on LinkedIn, be sure to follow Chris Costello for more engaging and really customer-focused content. And one last thing, if you've made it this far into the show, you really should subscribe. And here's why. Obviously, you're an ambitious B2B leader. Obviously, you're hungry for more actionable strategies on branding and marketing and sales. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here because you're looking to grow your business and boost sales. And so if that isn't enough, I would just say I'm also a nice guy. So that's worth a subscribe, right? Either way, I am Mark Drager, and I will catch you in the next episode.